If Gene Billingsley from GMT had said, okay, can you do something like Andean Abyss, but have it be two-player? I'm like, no, Gene, you don't get it. You just missed the whole point to the coin series. Of course, Brian Train did it, and it's awesome.
Welcome to Cardboard Creations, where we discuss the process, techniques, and inspiration for designing board games. I'm your host, Candice Harris, and I'm thrilled to be here today with Volko Ruhnke to find out how Andean Abyss was created. But first, let's jump into a quick overview of how Andean Abyss works. Andean Abyss is a 1 to 4 player game that depicts insurgent and counterinsurgent conflict in Colombia during the 1990s and early 2000s. Each player controls one of 4 asymmetric factions, either the government or one of 3 insurgent factions, the Marxist FARC, the right-wing AUC paramilitaries, or the narco-trafficking cartels. Each faction has its own menu of actions in addition to unique victory conditions that are aligned with their historic motivations. The government's goal is to expand the government's legitimacy throughout the country and gain as much support as possible. The FARC's goal is to build opposition to the government while sustaining logistics with bases. The AUC's goal is to eliminate FARC logistical bases while building more of their own. Meanwhile, the cartel's goal is to make money and grow a productive base to continue making money. Gameplay in Andean Abyss is driven by a deck of event cards and a unique turn eligibility system. At the start of each turn, 2 event cards are visible, the current event and the upcoming event, so that players can plan accordingly. Turn order is determined by the faction order shown at the top of the current event card. The first eligible faction can execute an operation, resolve an event on the current card, or pass. Following the sequence of play, the next eligible faction chooses from options available based on what the first eligible faction chose. At most, 2 factions will act on each event card, and after taking their actions, those factions become ineligible for the upcoming event card. When executing operations, players can spend resources to build and move forces on the map, attack enemies, and perform additional actions needed to achieve their victory conditions. 4 special propaganda cards which trigger scoring rounds are shuffled into the event deck. When a propaganda card becomes the active event card, normal gameplay pauses and victory conditions are checked, followed by some maintenance phases before gameplay resumes with the next event card. If any players have achieved their victory condition during the propaganda victory check, the game ends immediately. Otherwise, if the 4th and final propaganda round is completed, the game ends. In either case, the faction with the highest victory margin wins. Hi, Volko!
Hi, Candice.
Thanks so much for being on the show today and joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really delved into the coin series last year for the first time. And like many people, I started with Cuba Libre, and I have since branched out further, and I'm continuing to branch and just loving it more and more. So, the more coin games I play, the more I'm curious to know how it all started. So what initially inspired you to create Andean Abyss, the first coin game?
Well, it was a pretty direct growth out of the game I had done just before, which is Labyrinth: The War on Terror. And Labyrinth is a 2-player global scale terrorism, counterterrorism war game, really. And it's a card-driven game. So it's pretty typical, like Twilight Struggle sort of a format. But it being a 2-player game, there were real limitations in what we could represent with regard to multi-factional affairs. And in Labyrinth, one side's the United States and its allies, the other side is the jihadists and all the different flavors of jihadists around the world. And, I had to kind of jam those into 2-player roles. And I thought, what if I could examine insurgency as a topic, as a multifactional affair. And insurgency, because in Labyrinth, it's one of the premises of that game substantively, is that the conflict between the United States and Al-Qaeda was a global insurgency on Al-Qaeda's part and in effect, a global counterinsurgency on the part of the counter-terrorists. And I knew from my day job involved in foreign affairs analysis, insurgency was just a huge and enduring topic in history and political military affairs and national security affairs, and really, really undergamed. There are tons of war games about conventional wars, very little about insurgency. So I wanted to start a new series that took some lessons learned from the design of Labyrinth, applied them to insurgencies and counterinsurgencies at the national level, so a little bit zoomed in. Labyrinth was global. Now we're going to do just like a country at a time, with multiple players to look at different factions, and then some other twists to how cards interact based, coming from the experience of card-driven games in that format, but trying to turn things around in a different way to achieve some different effects. And Colombia was the story, the setting that offered itself as just immediately rich and attractive and with all kinds of great multi-way dynamics. And also a puzzle or a case study in counterinsurgency, because it was a case where counterinsurgency largely succeeded in facing down 3 separate insurgent enemies. So I wanted to explore how did they do that.
It's so fascinating. And I love the asymmetric factions and everybody having their own victory conditions. All right, I won't go too deep into that yet, but
that I should say, and that Labyrinth already had asymmetry,
right,
in terms of both victory conditions and how each of the sides did things. And that came from the fact that, the United States on one hand and Al-Qaeda on the other, I mean, they're playing pretty different games against each other.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's the way I wanted it to feel in Labyrinth. And so it was natural to apply that to multiple different factions in an insurgency game set in Colombia. And I was particularly inspired. There was a game by Joe Miranda called Battle for Baghdad. Okay. And it's a fairly straightforward playing 6-way game, and it's set during the Iraq War. And it's the United States, the United Nations, Al-Qaeda, the Sunni resistance, the Shia government. I mean, so there's 6 different, and they all have completely different victory conditions. 6 of them.
Wow.
And it was, yeah. And I was like, wow, and so when you're playing, you have to watch 5 other victory conditions instead of your own. And it was so intense. I thought, well, Joe Miranda, he's a very experienced designer. He can do it for 6. I can't do it for 6, but I bet I can do it for 4. Let me see.
That's awesome. And you did. You did it. So how did you get from, so you have the initial idea of counterinsurgency game in Colombia, set in Colombia. How did you get from that initial idea to a playable prototype?
So it's an interesting question. So let me show you what the first playable prototype looks like, and it's this. And you can see that I've got map and pieces already and little tracks, and the map is drawn with pen, and the pieces are just scarfed from other games and painted and stickered and so forth. But the start of this actually is what's along the left of the photo, and that is these charts of the operations. And that is actually the first thing I did, which was, if we're going to have 4 factions, what are their ends, and what ways do they use to pursue those ends? That's 2/3 of the classic definition of strategy: ends, ways, and means. The means are the bits, all those wooden pieces you see. That kind of came. And I had some rough ideas, but the first thing I wrote out was, not the rule book, not the map, not the order battle, not the cards. It was, what is on one sheet of paper with a reasonable size font that tells you, here's what I have to do to win, and here are all the different things I can do. Now, more or less, if you played the coin series, there's more information than on these ops menu foldouts, the operations and special activities. There's also what happens during a propaganda round or a coup round. And there's other details. But the heart of it, what you're doing most of the time and what you're trying to achieve, is on one page for you on that sheet. And so that's what I did. I just in Word, I'm typing up those sheets to give a shape of what is the personality of the cartel's faction? What is the personality of the government faction? Meaning, what are they trying to do and how do they do it?
Yeah.
And can I make that simple enough to fit on one page in summary form, but complete?
Gotcha.
Right? Potentially intelligible. I can write it out in longerhand in the rules. And that is a method that I have tried to use throughout. It's kind of imposes a discipline on me. Same once I got to the cards. I use a certain font on my cards, and I don't let myself go any smaller, and I don't change the margin. So here's a picture of another early, prototype set, and you can see the cards. And the cards also, I'm always tempted to put more and more words on it, right? Mm-hmm. But if I can't fit it onto that template, then it's too complicated, right? And then I need to basically cut something. And so that just maintains my own discipline to make sure that the thing doesn't run away into lots and lots and lots and lots of detail, and you end up with word bricks on the cards and 20 charts that you're shuffling around to try to figure out what the heck to do, right? I needed it to be reasonably accessible because I knew that it was a kind of topic that was going to be new to the market, and I needed every advantage and every trick to convince people to play this game.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of those was it's reasonably easy to get into. It's not a starter board game.
Right.
But it is easier to get into than is typical of the board war games, in the world that I come from.
Very, very cool. So you kind of started with that summary of knowing, okay, here are the factions and here's how they win the game, and here, summarizing what they're going to do. Where did you go from there in prototyping?
Then the next is going to be the map. What is the environment that they're doing that in? Okay. And that really I needed to set before I could get to the means, which is sort of how many pieces am I going to break this up into? Because I need to know what are the spaces that these pieces are maneuvering around, right? And so I can't have an Andean Abyss number of pieces on a Cuba Libre sized map, right? That's just going to be a mess of stuff. So that's the next thing is I knew I could, but how will I divide up Colombia? What makes sense? Point to point, area, hex map, and how many spaces do I need, and how many different terrain types do I need? And that's going to be then a guide to how many, pieces is the right number. Because a unit, you can have a unit be anything you want if you're the designer, right? So I could give you 3 pieces, or I could give you 300 pieces. But it's just how fine am I chopping up the cake, if you will, right? And I never tell you or have to tell you in coin, okay, so each of these pieces is 10,000 troops or anything like that, right? In fact, it doesn't even equate to more, because when you train, when you train forces for the government, you're putting pieces on the map. That doesn't necessarily, it does mean you're training some new troops, but it also means you're training existing troops and police to be more effective. So it's very flexible, right? So how many pieces I have is really, well, how much of the board do I want to cover, and how much do I want to allow or force you as a player to maneuver around? So typically in the modern era, lines of communication are very important. Who controls the roads, like the highway stretching north-south through South Vietnam? The communists were trying to cut that. The U.S. was trying to make sure it maintained that line of communication from north to south in this narrow country of South Vietnam. So similarly in Colombia, the roadways are important. And if the guerrillas can block a roadway, they can wreck the economy. And the FARC also was very much into kidnapping, and that's where they would put a barricade on a road somewhere and pick up people to kidnap and potentially ransom them. And the other thing that was really important in Colombia was energy, and specifically gas pipelines. Gas and oil pipelines. So the Colombian petrochemical industry had a big field, a place called Arauca, and there was a pipeline going to the sea. And so for the government to make its money, to make sure that the people would be happy and that the government had the wherewithal to fight the guerrillas, it was really, really important to keep this pipeline open. And that was just one pipeline of many. Well, the guerrillas were blowing it up, of course.
Yeah.
And so part of the fighting was going along this pipeline. So I thought of highways and pipelines as lines of communication. How do I represent that on the map? My idea was they can be the boundaries between spaces because they're long and skinny, right?
Right.
But we need to be fighting for them also, so the government can be occupying them, patrolling them, the guerrillas can get on them and wreck them or kidnap there or whatever. And so the lines of communications, and this is something that turned out to be pretty complicated to understand as you're playing the game, how to do this and how to use it effectively. They're boundaries, but they're also spaces at the same time. So it was a little bit of a, a twist. And I think for that purpose, it worked very well. But it is, as I said, it's a kind of a difficult thing to get your head around when you're playing.
Yeah, and this is the first episode of Cardboard Creations where we're featuring a historical board game. So I'm kind of curious to know, were you really well versed in this history before you started creating the game, or did you get the game idea, know a little bit, and then do a lot of homework to really understand the history to create the game?
So I was pretty well versed in sort of the theory of insurgency and counterinsurgency. And I knew from professional exposure to that Colombia had a particularly interesting history. Okay. And so that was enough to start then getting a lot deeper, and getting a bunch of books and all of that, as you might imagine, to delve into the details. And one question, and this is true for a number of games I've done, is what period of time exactly? Because the insurgency in Colombia began in the 60s. Okay, and that there's a peace agreement and, it's been imperfectly implemented, but really, if you can say the insurgency in Colombia largely came to an end, that was only in the last handful of years from today. So we have decades and decades of time available to the designer to say, well, what, do I want to cover all of that? I don't have to cover all of that.
Right.
And I chose a particular point in time, 1994 to the early 2000s, when there were 3 simultaneous challenges to the government, as I mentioned. And it just was the end of the Medellin cartel, with the Cali cartel still standing, a time of growth and offensive and maximum, like a high watermark for the FARC revolutionary guerrillas, and the time that the right-wing paramilitary outer defenses formed up together into a single umbrella entity, the AUC, and a time when the government decided, we're not just going to tolerate this like we have we're going to try to reestablish our legitimacy and control and sovereignty over the entirety of our country. We're not just going to give half of it up to guerrillas the way we have the last 30 years. And all of that's happening at the same time. So that means I can then burrow in and just get smart on that particular time period. And that's the story I want to tell in the game.
That's so awesome. When did you come up with the sequence of play and how that works?
That was pretty much next, because the next question was how are the cards going to get involved? Because my experience, I did Wilderness War and I did Labyrinth, and they're both classic card-driven games. And I love that form. Cards are so powerful in historical games because they let you bring in all kinds of events and personalities and technologies that are kind of off the central core mechanics. So if you think about those 4 faction sheets I mentioned with the actions and the victory conditions on them, that's like the core stuff. But there's all kinds of special stuff that you could do. And the cards are it's like a rules exception. It breaks the rules, right? It's a rules exception that you don't have to look up because it's right there on the card when you need it, right? Yeah. So that's just wonderful. So I didn't want to let go of that. I absolutely wanted to have, like a card-driven game, a trade-off between taking advantage of an event as an opportunity, as sort of a one-time opportunity, or giving that up and doing your usual menu of actions, operations, and special activities. So what I wanted to get away from in CDGs is a lot of this.
Yeah.
Hand management, okay? And hand management is a lot of fun. Love hand management as a game. But for historical games, one thing it does is it puts your focus on this set of cards and what order to play them on, and you lose focus a little bit from what's the situation on the map. And what I'm trying to, make you feel like is you're in charge of this campaign, and you're looking at a giant map of Colombia, and there's unit positions, and you're just, what I'm saying? I want you to be focused on the map. And so how do I get you back to the map and still keep the cards? So that was the problem I was trying to solve with what became the sequence of play for the coin series, right? Cool. Which is, we're going to have events, and you're going to get to choose between events and ops, but not with everybody having their own cards. We're just going to flip a card. We're going to look at it. Everybody's going to see what it is. And then there's going to be a semi-random initiative order that determines who now gets to go first. Because if you're doing guerrillas in the jungle, it's not so much a matter of, okay, I've got the firepower, I'm gonna blast you. I have to find you, right? Or if you sneak up on me, you're gonna blast me. And sort of who has the initiative? There's an action reaction there, and the question is who's going to get the jump on the other person, usually because of better information. Right. So how do I generate that? So I wanted to have random initiative, semi-random initiative, so that I could generate that uncertainty. Do the guerrillas get hit? Do they get exposed and hit by the government, or do they get away or cover themselves up before the government can nail them, right? Right. So that's the sequence of initiative. So I can show you a picture of one of these cards. The 4 factions across the top, equal permutations through the deck. 2 of them will get to act, and 2 of them will then essentially own the next card and act on the next card. And the events come in as, well, you can do the event or you can do the operations. But if you do the event, then your enemy is going to get to the operations. If you do the operations, then your enemy is going to get to the event. So that's the basic trade-off idea on the same card. And then you'll notice there's like a shaded and unshaded part of the event. And that came from Labyrinth also, where in Labyrinth, there were tactics in the War on Terror that had their upside and their downside, if you will, right? They're effective in one way, but there was a problem with them, a cost. Usually, if there's something that's maybe it's effective from a counterterrorism, from a kinetic perspective, but politically there's a prestige backlash, against the United States, something like that, for example. So there's sort of what I called in Labyrinth dual events. There's some of them. Right. And I thought, well, that's true of almost anything in history. There are always alternative historical interpretations. Most things are a double-edged sword in a complex world. And very often there are also competing interpretation. One historian says this was a useful thing, and one historian said, no, this was counterproductive. And so with dual events, I can just have it both ways on almost every card, right? And so a lot, not every, but a lot of them are that way. So that no matter whether you're the government or the insurgent, there's potentially something on that card that's of interest to you, more or less. Anyway, so that's on the cards as well. And that was sort of the original idea. As we played it, it developed a lot just from experience. And so, for example, if we look at what the sequence of play finally looked like, you can see that there's something called the limited operation, or LIMOP. And that did not exist in the first version at all. If you're familiar with the Corn series, you're like, how would it work without the LIMOP? Well, it does not well, which is what we discovered when we played it, because the original idea was you take the ops or you take the event. That's it, or you pass. And we were playing it, and one of my friends, Wendell, we were playing it in this room, and he just was taking a little marker every time he had to pass. And he was passing because the event wasn't attractive enough for him to take, and that's what he'd been offered. And he said, I have 9 markers here. The last 9 turns, all I've done is pass. Sound like fun? No. So it's like we have to give players a kind of a consolation option if they're not interested in the event at that time. Right. Because I tried to write the events to be equally attractive, but that's hard to do too, and it's not the case. So that's where the limit operation, which was, it's like the operation, but you don't get to do the special thing. You don't get to do your little add-on thing for your faction, your special activity, and you don't get to do it all over the map. You can only do it in one spot.
Right.
And that's a limit operation. And that then solved that problem, because now the situation was, yeah, you could get unlucky in the sequence. It'll even out sooner or later, but you could get unlucky and just be offered a limited operation several times. But that's going to happen to everybody. And the really skilled players know how to make the most out of their limited opportunities, right? The limited operation. And so that works. So that's one thing that now is, it's just absolutely basic, but it didn't come in until we tested it and found out we needed it. The other thing that came in that way was, you're looking at the same card and two of you are going to act on that card, but you also get some tactical intelligence. You get to look ahead at the next one card. Right? Awesome. So the one that's like on deck, that also was completely made up as we went through and we actually played it. He said, what if, this was sort of someone, I don't know who was who said it. Somebody was saying, what if we just could see the next card coming? Oh, let's try it. Oh, that kind of is fun. Let's make that an optional rule. And then we're finally like, no, that's much better, because now the two players who are up on the one card, they're dealing with that card. But the other two players have something to do, because they can look at that next card and already be thinking about, what do I want to do? And as you consider your choices on the current card, one possibility is you can pass and act on the next card. And you also want to know, well, who gets to act on the next card and what are they going to be able to do? And it just makes it much more interesting.
Oh, and, yeah, the decision space is incredible, from just being able to see those two event cards and just the eligibility system.
And
it's really cool.
The method is not, oh, I thought of that, and oh, this is, no, the method was just playing it and brains just, and experimenting. Really, it's really serendipity to get to that.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, because that's very signature to all coin games, that eligibility system, even though it varies, later down the line, and Colonial Twilight and All Bridges Burning.
And People Power coming up. And so so what happened from there, I mean, we're talking about the beginning Andean Abyss, and it's me and my developer, Joel Toppin, who'd done Labyrinth with me, and was responsible for things like the edge, just using an edge track, which is like, there's some things that, you don't see it until somebody points it out to you, even though it's so obvious. I mean, how many board games have edge tracks for scoring? Duh, but I hadn't thought of that. So, and I could show you another picture here where this kind of shows up. The original, in fact, if you look at the original prototype, I had little tracks with little markers and cubes and sliding them all were down. What a mess, and Joel said, well, why don't we just put that all in one big edge track and have a big counter to count the resources up and a couple markers for victory points done. Yeah, easy. But it was just us. And I had my series laid out that I had thought of for GMT of 4 games, and one in Latin America, one in Sub-Saharan Africa, one in Southeast Asia, and one in the Middle East. And that's it. And the only game out of all of those that I ever ended up making myself was Andean Abyss, because that's where Cuba Libre and Colonial Twilight and A Distant Plain and other designers came in and had ideas and concepts of where to go that, again, there was really no way for me to think of. I mean, I never would, if somebody would have said, if Gene Billingsley from GMT had said, okay, can you do something like Andean Abyss but have it be 2-player? I'm like, no, Gene, you don't get it. You just missed the whole point to the coin series. Of course, Brian Train did it, and it's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. So how did you work in the propaganda cards into the mix? Like, when did that come up?
So this is sort of a scoring round kind of mechanic. And the idea behind the propaganda cards was we needed, every once in a while, we need to take a snapshot on the progress of the insurgency and the counterinsurgency. And I don't want you to know exactly when that's going to be. That's going to be highly variable. And later on, these cards in later volumes became things like Winter. where there really is. And in winter is a little bit different because you kind of know. You might not know exactly what day winter starts, but you kind of know when winter's coming. Propaganda was very abstract. It's just every once in a while it just matters. And I thought of it as propaganda because in a political military struggle, it's when there's suddenly some media attention or world attention or national attention on something that what's happening right now really matters. This problem might be going on up and down. The indices are going up and down all the time. But right now, everybody's focused on the situation at the US border, for example, something like that, right? So what's happening right now? And so the propaganda cards in Andean Abyss, I thought they should just be completely variable. Who knows when they happen? They could be any time. There's going to be 4 of them in the full deck, but you won't know. And so you need to be striving all the time. And then the particulars that came up to do with that in the later series was, should we have that card showing 1 ahead? Okay, because coin series designers divide on this, and some of them I know have very strong views one way or the other as to whether it's better for gameplay and for realism that you do have a card warning that the scoring is coming, or you don't.
Yeah.
And so the mechanism that Harold Buchanan and Mike Berticelli came up with for Liberty or Death, the one in the American Revolution, and that and in a similar way, Morgan Guillen-Reddy adopted in Pendragon, was when that card flips up, the scoring card, the propaganda card, whatever it's called, when that flips up, it switches places, and or it just moves over, and you happen immediately. And my position is there are good and bad things about doing that, and so it's a sort of one of those, which way do you like to lean?
Right. Very cool. I guess one other question in terms of like getting your prototype together and going through the development phase. Andean Abyss has a thick deck of cards like most coin games do. How did you actually come up with all of those event cards? And did you start small with like 10 or
Yeah, so it's interesting. So there are 72 events, and that comes from how many permutations are there of 4 factions in order. There are 24 permutations.
Okay.
And for fairness, I thought it made sense to have the same number of cards in the deck with each permutation, so that your chances of being first, second, third, or fourth is at the outset of any given game identical to your 3 opponents. Okay. So that meant multiples of 24 cards. If I only have your permutation in once, that's 24. So that didn't seem enough. 48 didn't seem enough. 72 seemed like the right size deck. So I had to come up with 72 events, and I had to pair them with 3 each of each permutation, 24 permutations, right? Okay, so you have to do that. And how? Well, first of all, from just the knowledge I had coming in, there are just certain things that I know I didn't get into those faction sheets, the basic ops and specials, right, they're important, and I just already knew about, like, Army helicopters, right? There is airlift, but when they get Black Hawk helicopters in this period, the Colombian government really amps up its ability to do airlift. So how am I going to bring that in? That's an event right away. And it's a special kind of event because one part of the story in Andean Abyss in particular is that the government was getting better and better and better at doing this. Better in equipment, in training, in doctrine, and in commitment, and in the ability to fuse police, military, and civilian government into one combined counterinsurgency effort. So these were all themes of the Colombia as a counterinsurgency case study, what they did right. And so the government side has capabilities, which are events. And that means this event comes up, and usually an event does something for you that's really cool, like quick, you kill some enemy guys or something. The capability cards for the government alone were to tell the story of the government gradually getting better. And the capability cards don't do anything right away. But if you take them, if you basically do your pause in your operations and invest in this capability, now that whatever that thing is, that sexy thing that you can now do, you do for the rest of the game. So part of that was, okay, well, what were the things that the government learned to do? And that go back to literature. Well, there are these 8 different things, and those are 8 events. For the insurgents, it was more a matter of temporary momentum. So I came up with momentum cards that for them that they get to do something for until the next propaganda card comes up. Not forever, for a time,
right,
but an uncertain time, right? And so that's in there. And then the one-time events. And as I'm reading, if it's a rich story, and Colombia's absolutely, Colombian counterinsurgency is a very rich story. Oh yeah, I mean, I got my pencil out, with the book, and okay, event, and you just get a sense very quickly. What are those things that affect the core mechanics? They affect how the main rules, but they kind of came up once or a few times or in a certain way, or maybe never would have come up at all, right? Those are the event cards. So when I did Fire in the Lake, of course, Mark Herman, my co-designer, who's done this sort of thing, since I was in high school, literally. So he came up with, the event cards for Fire in the Lake, and I kind of translated them into coinese, if you will. I kind of gave them mechanical aspects. But he wrote, we're going to have one that does this, name that, and so forth.
Cool.
And at one point I think we had 72 also in Fire in the Lake event cards. And, we were like, we're going to have to chop a lot of stuff because of Vietnam. You want to talk about a rich history, of course, the United States and Vietnam,
right.
Tons written about it. There's a very rich history. Anyway, and Mark Herman is a huge expert on that. And so he had all sorts of stuff. And so we went to Gene. He said, we're going to have to cut out a lot of stuff. He says, okay, don't cut stuff. Go to 5 instead of 3 copies of each permutation. So what is that? Was the arithmetic 70? Not 72, but 72 plus 48. What is 120? 120. Right. 120 event cards, not counting the coup cards, which Mark came up. Those are going to be event cards too. So that kind of got slipped in. The propaganda cards now are different events. So suddenly Mark had open the ability to add a whole bunch of other event cards. And say he just got on his treadmill, while he's doing his run. He's not even reading a book.
Right.
He's just remembering all the books that he's read 2 or 3 times already. I mean,
Wow.
It's like that, He's read more
crazy.
about Vietnam than, he's forgotten more about Vietnam than I ever knew or will know. But anyway, so yeah, he said, and by the time he's done with his run on the treadmill, he had the, up to the 120 event cards.
Wow.
So just like that. Yeah. But if you've got rich material, right, event cards are so flexible way to bring history or other texture from any world that you're representing onto the game table. That really coming up with the event cards for me is among the easier things to do. It can be hard to kind of like, how do I get this? How do I capture the effect of this? How do I represent this very complex affair and something that I can fit on a playing card? That sometimes is difficult, but coming up with ideas of how to fill out a deck is usually, for me, pretty easy.
That's really cool, by the way. And it's also exciting to hear about Fire in the Lake because it's on my list to play, but I'm kind of like working up to that and Pendragon because I know they're a little more complicated.
There's a lot going on in them.
Yeah. So how do you actually create your cards when you're prototyping? Are you using cardstock or printing? Do you use an Excel spreadsheet or handwriting?
I'm on Word. And I just have it's a 3x3 matrix on each sheet, and I'm filling in the cards and I'm pasting in little photos from the web or wherever and little symbols. So I work a great deal just in Word, and then for the physical set, I put them in card sleeves, and I have a shoebox of old Pokemon cards from when my kids were little, that they don't know I still have, and I'm not harming them. I'm not harming the little pocket creatures. I'm just putting them inside, and then putting a cutout. I print the word on a regular sheet. I cut it with scissors. I slip it in. When I make a change, pull it out, pencil in the change, slip it back in. At a certain point, with a lot of pencil marks all over the thing, I go in, I update, and print out a new set. scissors, and
Gotcha.
it's in again. Yeah. And I will tell you, I had a chance to play the original Twilight Struggle prototype
Ooh.
with Jason Matthews and Nanda Gupta, Jason's wife Vonda. She had made a beautiful foam core, I mean, cut out the continent and the spaces, foam core map of the world. They had originally little wooden pieces that fight, like military pieces that would fight out things in
Oh,
Europe,
wow.
all stickered. All the cards, when I had done at that point, when I was prototyping, I didn't put photos on cards. I just did little handwritten things and I cut them out of cardboard. I mean, I was really primitive back then. That's where I got the ideas from them, from Jason and Nanda. They already had photographs for all their cards and the text printed out and everything, and they were fantastic, and they laminated them.
Oh.
So here we are, we're at the con, first prototype, debut of Twilight Struggle. GMT hasn't taken it yet, and they're playing with laminated cards. Now, I had been through Wilderness War, and I said, guys, you are going to be regretting laminating these cards because you're going to be making changes like nothing to these event cards. But I just tell that story because you don't do that. Don't. It looks great, but if you put this with the sleeves and the little sheet, little slip, another playing card in there for stiffness, and you're good to go. It's very easy to make updates because you're going to make updates. Every time you play, you're going to be scribbling notes to change text on cards.
Sure. Cool. That's really good to know. What was your process like for playtesting? I know, Andean Abyss is, optimally played with 4 players, but then you have non-player factions for either if you're playing with 2 players or solo or 3 players.
Right.
What was your playtesting process like?
So I brought it to cons where people are playing card-driven war games because Andean Abyss bounced off of that. So it kind of came out of that culture, if you will. So I knew I could get people interested in trying it out, and they would be people who knew games more or less the way I did. They're of my circles in terms of game playing, I guess. And then similarly had friends over, and I was fortunate and still am to live in a part of the world and in a part of the country where there are a lot of board gamers and historical board gamers in particular near Washington, D.C. And so it was really no problem getting people over to test things out. And, war gamers like me, they're not particularly delicate. So they tell you right away something sucks, and so they're really very effective testers in terms of, giving you the feedback you need
hilarious.
to hear if you like. Yeah.
Did you try to play test with 4 only for a while, 4 players? Or were you just, play testing solo at the same time?
Yeah. So the actual solo systems, and we can talk about that, because that's a separate sort of design evolution. They came later, and I can explain why that is. So I'm playing, first of all, myself. I'm playing 4-handed, playing all sides. And then actually the second step before I would take it to the kind of groups that I mentioned was my frontline testers are my sons, or were at the time. They're grown now. But so I'll show you a picture of lead tester Andrew in the game room. This is with a fairly late version, as it happens, of the pre-publication game. But my standard practice after playing some myself was to take it to the boys and see if they thought it was fun. Because they, if I could get them interested in it and they wanted to play more, then I kind of knew I had something, and that was a warm fuzzy that this was something that people would enjoy. And so that was the case here too. It was the case with the next several Coin Series volumes. We were at the beach once, actually, and I was cutting out the bits and taping together the map for A Distant Plane, so that we could all play it. We were at a lake cabin with Labyrinth earlier in 2009. It was the same thing. I was like assembling the prototype, and then the boys and I played it the first time to, because they will respond to it or not, and so that's the first measure.
What an awesome household to grow up in.
Well, it's awesome for Dad.
Yeah.
As you can imagine. And as it happened with Andrew, as some folks may know, so he and I ended up doing a coin series volume together, which was Falling Sky, Caesar and the Gallic Revolt, and that was a co-design with Andrew, who knew all of the coin games from the ground up, and so was very capable of doing that as a teenager. I'll tell you one more story with the boys. I was on the phone with Mark Herman during the development of Fire in the Lake, and I said to him, with my tests here, we just can't get the U.S. and the ARVN, the anti-communists, to win. The communists are always winning when I play. And he's like, I don't understand. I said, well, because the U.S. and ARVN, they just won't work together. I mean, it's supposed to be a bad marriage. They're supposed to work together some, but have tensions, and then they just are destroying each other, and the communists take it. And he's like, well, that's not what I've seen. And I said, for example, when Andrew plays the ARVN and Daniel plays the U.S., and Mark said, well, wait a minute, those are your boys? I said, yeah. And he said, okay, I get it. They're brothers. Of course they're not going to cooperate. You just explained the whole thing, so. So it matters. It matters who your play testers are in terms of the results you get, because they, of course, will just,
Yeah.
And so you have to take that into account. So you asked about the solitaire system, and so that's a rather different evolution. So that also goes back to Labyrinth, and the idea was it's a two-player game. But Gene, from the beginning, said, can you do a system so that you can play as the U.S. solitaire? And he wanted that because he was afraid that this was 2009. He was afraid at that point nobody would want to play the terrorists. And he was afraid he couldn't sell the game unless he said, well, you can just be the United States and play solitaire. And then he kind of said, if you've got the guts to do it, Volko, And so now I'm not a big solitaire player, I will tell you, but I thought, okay, I'm going to try to do this. And my approach there, which I think there have been solitaire historical board games for a long time. This wasn't a solitaire from the ground up. Labyrinth was a two-player game, and I'm gonna give you an algorithm that more or less is going to be as if you're playing another player as the jihadists. And the approach there, and this was just pencil sketches on a paper, but it basically is an algorithm to me is a flow chart, and doing things in a way that, are reasonable moves. And what's going to spice it up, that is make it different one time to another, is mainly going to be what cards come up, so that the algorithm reacts to what's the card that it's playing.
Gotcha.
Right? And that's going to result in different moves every time, because the cards are like the randomizer for the opponent. There's so many permutations of how these cards can come up that give you a different solitaire experience each time. Like, that was the concept. And so that, and that worked okay in Labyrinth. So having done it in Labyrinth for one, I'd never done anything like that. And I didn't know anything like that out there. So it was pretty cool that it kind of worked. Reasonably worked. But then I thought, okay, if I can do it for one player in Labyrinth, can I do it for three at a time in Andean Abyss? That was like the challenge to it. It was just kind of like a challenge. Could I make it feel like you actually did have three other people sitting around the table, but they're all just flow charts reacting to the cards?
Right.
And it kind of works. Now, since then, that was the beginning, and that design is completely separate and after the four-player game.
Gotcha.
Right? The idea was this is going to be a four-player game, and we'll give you ways you can pair off if you want, and maybe some people will enjoy it the way I do just by playing four-handed. But the principal experience, the main idea that you're buying here, is four people playing against each other, asymmetric, okay, factional, and one of you four wins. And it's principally therefore a negotiation game, right? I mean, you're moving forces around and stuff, but it's because there are four factions and there's so many ways to help and hurt each other. It's mainly a game of what's going on among those four people, right? That's that's the heart of the experience, really. Okay, I wanted to make that. This is also part of I got to convince people to buy a game about Colombian counterinsurgency, right?
Right.
So it's got to have a number of things. It's got to be accessible. The charts need to be easy to read and use. It's got to look pretty, you know. It's got to not look intimidating. It's got to look attractive. It's got to look like, oh, that's look at those pieces. Those are cool, right? That was
Right.
another trick to convince you to play a game about Colombian counterinsurgency. And another way to convince you is you don't need 4 people to play it. You can play it with 3 people, and then 1 is a flowchart. You can play it with 2 people, and 2 are a flowchart. Or you can play it solitaire, and I'm going to give you 3 flowcharts, and you can operate it. And so, as I said, that worked well enough that a lot of people got interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got around to Cuba Libre, we already had Orion Ariander, who later on BGG became like the father of the bots, you know, and designed a lot of and redesigned, including back for Andean Abyss, a lot of the bots in the coin series, because he advised me on how to make the bots in Cuba Libre better than what I could do.
Gotcha.
And of course, now we have Bruce Mansfield and GMT1 and whole new ways of doing this that, once again, there's no way I would have even been able to think of it, much less execute it.
Right.
And so the original flowcharts in Andean Abyss, I do think, they kind of look pretty crappy in comparison, but you have to start somewhere.
Right. Cool. So what was your biggest challenge during the development of Andean Abyss?
You know, I really think it was what we've been talking about a little bit, and that is convincing people that this is something they want. And, you know, so it's, of course, very heartening that the coin series now has so much momentum on its own. But as I mentioned to a friend just the other day, Andean Abyss has a sort of special place in my heart because I feel like it was the one that had to struggle to be heard, you know, or struggle to be accepted. Because it was different. It was different. And so, for example, you know, games will have a complexity rating. So GMT has a 9-point complexity rating, and I was used to being at 4. That's kind of my zone, you know, 4 out of 9. Wilderness, War, and Labyrinth are there, meaning less than average in terms of complexity of games that GMT publishes, you know, mainly war games. Not, you wouldn't call it an easy game. That's a 1, 2, or 3, you know. But it's low, medium complexity, and that's where I live, you know, and that's where I wanted to be. And Gene, when he got Andean Abyss, said it's a 6. And I was like, well, you know, so we went back and forth about that, and finally we compromised on 5, you know. But he was right in a way, because what he sensed that I couldn't sense is that not necessarily that Andean Abyss is that difficult. It's just that it was weird.
Different
for the audience. It was different for the audience, for GMT's usual audience. And it was trying to fill in a gap in the repertoire between standard military historical games that look a certain way and work a certain way, and Euro games that look a certain way and work a certain way. And it was taking a little bit of this and a little bit of that and trying to lure people into something that was in a chasm in between. That's kind of how I see it. And Andean Abyss was, when it was just Andean Abyss and it wasn't made yet, it wasn't printed, it was on pre-order. And it needs to get, you know, not just 500 really, but 700 and up pre-orders. And it's moving very, very slow.
Yeah.
Now I want to say Twilight Struggle originally moved very slow too. You know, and it took some time.
Yeah.
It took some time, and it took Alan Moon liking it publicly, right, to get it to gain acceptance. So that the marketing part of it was hard for me, and I get involved in that because if I can't convince you to pre-order this game, it's not going to get made.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't always succeed. I have failed at that. At the time, one of the main fora where I was used to interacting with my audience was Constant World. So war game chat bulletin boards.
Okay.
And Gene is on there too, GMT Games president. And so here's Andean Abyss. It's not doing well. And so he got on there. Now, this is sort of a natural thing. He's trying to figure out for his business, how does he sell stuff? What sells? What's the issue? And he said, here's Volko. He's well established, popular designer, did Labyrinth and all that. And he's got this really, interesting game on Columbia. And I'm just curious, why are you not
pre-ordering it?
Game?
Yeah.
Why are you not pre-ordering this game? And I'm trying to build this bandwagon, and Gene has just invited 100 people to post in a row why not to buy this game. So now we got past that, but he got the answer, and the answer by and large was the topic. By and large was, I'm just not interested in insurgency in Colombia. That's it.
Gotcha.
And is this an impediment for the COIN series?
Right.
That COIN stands for counterinsurgency? No, I mean, it's irrelevant because the acceptance is there. But it's there now because people have played Cuba Libre, and because people have played Fire in the Lake. Mm-hmm. I didn't have a Mark Herman COIN co-design at the time of Andean Abyss. I think that was really the biggest challenge. It was, what tricks can we pull to make you think you want this?
Yeah.
Right?
So you check it out and realize you do want it.
Yeah. So exactly.
Ah,
we hope.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Did you have any aha moments during the design or development phase of making Andean Abyss? Like, was there anything that was like, ooh, this is the special sauce?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things I've talked about that are mostly the serendipitous things, the revealing one card ahead and how much that added, the lim-op and how much that added to the just the tactical richness of it, the focusing on the bases of which is the bases for the insurgents represents their infrastructure, political, logistical. It's their cadre, their actual bases, literally in the jungle, that kind of thing. And for that to be more important than how many foot soldiers you have out there, well, yeah, that absolutely totally made sense. And so you had cases like that where things that worked well from just a gameplay perspective, just in terms of it being easier and more fulfilling to play that way, actually came back and said, yeah, and actually that is a better simulation. That happens a lot in game design where it's not just reality that's informing your simulation, but then problems you face in simulation raise and answer questions about your model of reality, that you didn't know were there. And so that issue with focusing on counting the bases rather than growth rate, it seems like such a simple thing, but again, you don't see it until you see it.
Right.
And you don't necessarily understand it about a complex real world affair until you see it play out in a simplified form on the game table. And you get that experience when you play a game that's about something. You get a much richer understanding, mental model of the dynamics of that thing in real life, if it were or fiction, if it's representing Tolkien or Star Wars or something. And when you design a game, that happens too, and even more intensely, right? Because you have to now make your model work. It has to run on the table. People actually have to be able to play it, and it has to produce plausible results. And so you're tuning, and you're discovering gaps, and you're filling them, and you're discovering that things you thought were really important really aren't that important, and so forth. And so it's those kinds of examples that came out of Andean Abyss for me also. Yeah.
Very cool. Wow. How were the art and graphic design decisions made for Andean Abyss? Because that map is gorgeous. Like I love the colors. It pops on the table, I do too. So yeah, that's Chechu Nieto Sanchez, who has done, I'm happy to say, has been on all the game boards since Andean Abyss was the first one, and he just does phenomenal work. He does great medieval looking stuff too in my current series, Living Campaign. So that's through GMT. So what happens is when
you're on P500, you're out for pre-order, it gets to a certain point and you're kind of in queue, you're in line to be assigned an art team. And so as the designer, that's what you're waiting for, is to have your, the art team that says, okay, we've got an artist free, or and it's multiple artists. There's, somebody else is doing the cards and the rules layout and so forth. So Mark Simonich at GMT runs all that. And so that's what you want, is you want to get the note from Mark saying, hey, okay, we're ready. You've got enough pre-orders and we want to produce this year, and we have an artist available. And so I tend to be very much in touch with the artists. I'm going through that right now with Almoravid on medieval Spain. And it's, of course, very fulfilling, but I'm also, because if the artist, typically they've not played the game, right? So they're kind of executing based on whatever probably crappy looking graphics, you've given them, right? And they're imagining it. And so I think it is very important for the designer who knows what the art is supposed to achieve in terms of understanding of the game, of the gameplay, execution of the game, right? Gameplay. And for a historical game, for immersion, because I'm trying here to transport you to Colombia in 1995 or whatever, right? So, and I have ideas about what that should look like.
Right.
So there's a lot of back and forth, and, make the jungle darker or lighter, or, make this bigger or smaller, or all that. And it's a joy because you're seeing it realized.
Right.
And you're seeing it realized in a beautiful way. So that's great. But it's also a lot of picayune proofreading and, could you make this a little bigger or that a little darker, whatever. And that goes on for weeks and weeks for all the components, right?
Cool. And even positioning, like where each faction's pieces are going to be held, like those boxes and where the bases are. It seems like very well laid out. Like there was a lot of thought that went into that.
Yeah. Thinking about all that, and a lot of compromise.
Yeah.
Everything is balancing. You're juggling everything. I mean, this was what I really felt going back to the first game I did, which was Wilderness War and the French and Indian War. During design, it is all compromises and balancing and ripple effects, and sort of everything kind of fits in. It's like, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make this bigger to solve some problem. Okay, fine. But now it's out of proportion to all these, 6 other things. And then you've got to tune those. And then you run one test and find out, oh, that doesn't quite fit, and we got to change this, and it ripples back through. So that's happening in the layout of the game board and everything else in the system. And it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen those. When I was a kid, there were these toys. They were like little magnets, and they're like magnets in plastic bubbles. Okay. And they're magnets, and on one side they're painted yellow, and the other side they're black. Okay. And you've got a little magnet wand, and with the wand you can flip the magnet over in one of these bubbles on your thing here. You flip it, and the object of the game is to flip them all to the same color. Like maybe there's like 24 bubbles or something. You got to flip them all the same color. But when you flip one magnet, guess what happens? A bunch of other magnets, because the field changes, right?
Yeah.
And a bunch of other ones. And so and it is just so frustrating.
That's a great metaphor.
I hated that toy.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like that, because you flip one magnet in one part of,
and there's a ripple
maybe
effect.
It's in the graph, but now then what impact does that have over here? Everything's interlocking. Ultimately, it's one system. Everything's interlocking. The symbols need to match up. The mechanics need to match up. And so it is painstaking. And it's, I think, part of the reason why there are a couple of phenomena in board gaming. There are many, many, many game ideas for very few playable prototypes. Mm. And there are there are many playable prototypes for few published games.
Sure. And
there are many published games that are kind of rough for few that are really polished jewels, right? And a lot of that is because it's at the end of the day a lot of perseverance and persnickety, pay attention to little details and proof it again, and look at it again. And then, of course, even then, you catch 99% of the errors, but the errors that the public gets, well, they're going to see that 1% there that you didn't get.
Yeah.
And like, how could you miss that, right? Well, now that I see it, I don't know either, but you don't see it till you see it. I think you'd ask me kind of what knowledge did I come to the project with before I went and bought, books about Colombia. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I had set on Colombia as the first game in the coin series was because it is in fact a case, a case study of counterinsurgency. And it is a case that is studied in terms of its success of 1990s, early 2000s, and how did the Colombians face down these different insurgencies and really establish their government control of the country. How did they do that? And it was studied by other countries, and the Colombians taught other countries how to do it too. And I knew that story because I had heard a lecture by a gentleman named Tom Marks. And Tom Marks was a practitioner of counterinsurgency. He was an advisor, including to Bogota. And he was a scholar of it. And I'd heard his lecture about Colombian counterinsurgency and how the Colombians did this, like what they did right and how it worked. He had also been a journalist for Soldier of Fortune magazine. And so he had a whole bunch of photography that he'd taken for Soldier of Fortune that was his photography. And so I got in touch with them, and and so in addition to the fact that a lot of the substantive basis for Andean Abyss, for the model that's in Andean Abyss, comes from Tom Marks's scholarship. A lot of the photography in the game actually is his photography because I said I want to, I met with him, and of course to ask him various questions about about Colombia and his experiences there and the theory behind it and so forth, but also to get his photography. And he gave me these they're like little slides, and I had to like buy a slide to digital little converter machine.
Wow.
And so, for example, this photograph, not all these pictures, but for example, the two on the left, those are photographs from Tom Marks. The cover, that soldier, not the jungle background, that's from Roger McGowan, who did the cover composition, but that soldier is from a photograph by Tom Marks. And cool. So that was really cool to have that source for some original photography, but it got for me cooler than that. So Tom Marks, by the time Andean Abyss is published, Tom Marks is running an academic department at National Defense University in Washington, D.C. that deals with, among other things, insurgency and counterinsurgency. And so I wanted to go present him a copy of Andean Abyss. And so let me show you this picture. So this is me with Tom Marks in his office, with the published, can you imagine, it's pretty exciting for me, this published copy of this game about a topic, of course, that he knows very well with his photograph on the cover. So pretty cool.
Awesome.
So that would have been awesome enough, but that's not the awesome part.
There's more.
So there is more. So this is, so I told you this is going to be a kind of a long story and not just about art. So in the story of how the Colombians defeated these insurgencies, one of the key players is a general named Carlos Ospina, and he's a division corps commander, I think, and then he becomes general of the army and finally, ultimately, the whole armed forces. But he was the key strategist in counterinsurgency for the Colombians. How did he study the enemy's thinking and documents and strategy and came up with how the approach would run, according to Tom Marks. So I knew about him from Tom Marks. So by this time, Carlos Ospina is actually on the faculty of Tom Marks' department at the National Defense University. And so Tom Marks says, well, I'm going to bring you into General Ospina's classroom where he's teaching about insurgency and counterinsurgency, right? So you can give him a copy of the game. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be so awesome.
That's awesome.
So that's exactly what we did. So you can here it is. The way it went was that Tom it was really unfair to Professor Ospina, I think, but because Tom's his boss, right? Uh-huh. So we march in there while he's lecturing. He's got the slides up: insurgency, counterinsurgency. Wow. I mean, it was like the whole class is there, and so Professor Ospina, General Ospina, has to pause. Oh, this is my boss, and Tom Marks says, "Oh, I want you to meet Volko here." Yeah. And so I get up there. So I'm sorry to interrupt, the class. I'm here because I am a board game designer. Can you imagine what these people are? I'm a board game designer, and I just published this game about insurgency and counterinsurgency in Colombia. And of course, General Espina is an important figure in the game. And I held up in the game, you can play the Espina card. And like I held up the card
Yeah.
because here he is, and it's with Tom Mark's photo of Espina. And the class loved it. Like
That's so cool.
it's our professor, and so I could show. I showed General Espina the card, and he, gave him a copy, and then of course had to get his autograph. And so I have. So my copy of Andean Abyss has General Espina's signature in it with a nice, thank you for your important work sign in there. And so, how many designers get to do that? To like the guy is a character in the game, he's a card in the game, and you get to meet him and give him a copy of your game.
That's so cool. That's awesome.
That's tough. I'm just never gonna beat that.
Wow, that's so awesome. That's a great story, Volko. So question, when and how did you come up with the name Andean Abyss?
Yeah, so that was not the original title, once again, trying it out on people. So I originally just wanted to call it FARC. Okay. FARC is the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, right? It's the Colombian Revolutionary Armed Forces, and they're the main antagonist for the government, the most important guerrilla group. And for me, in my experience, when I hear FARC, I think of Colombia and Colombian insurgency. Mm-hmm. And I tried that title out on friends of mine and said, I don't want to play a game called FARC. Okay. I market tested it in a way. I did some market research or whatever. And I guess in addition to the alliteration and the intentional internal contradiction of Andean Abyss, I think I wanted to get across this is a serious topic. Mm. And of course, when the game was published, the war was not over, and the people that are depicted in the game are real people who went through real difficulties. And I had Colombian involvement, I had a playtest team in Bogota, wonderfully, and I also had the opportunity to playtest the game with somebody who had lived in Colombia a long time, knew Colombia, wife Colombian, and I asked him. I said, "Is this Colombia?" We played the game. Then, is this Colombia? Does it take? He says, "Yeah, this is okay." There's just one more shot I want to show you. It's just a photograph from BGG that I'm just very fond of. This is Esteban Vasquez, Colombian BGGer, and he's enthusiastic enough about the game to, kind of try to dress up in Colombian traditional garb and take this photograph. That means a lot to me. I want what's in the game to be respectful. I want it to be serious. And I'm not saying I'm trying to pull punches and say, well, everybody's a good guy or equal or is equally deserving of understanding. I want to deal with it in a serious way. I'm not trying, the fun of it is to understand the real world. It's kind of maybe it's a strange concept for historical board gaming, but because the topic is consequential, because people really live this, because it mattered for what happened to them and where the country is now, right. Is what makes it interesting enough to do a game on for me, mm-hmm. right? And so I don't want to sugarcoat anything. So
makes sense.
Colombia at the beginning of this game in the early 1990s was considered, if not a failed state, a likely soon to be failed state. And it is today a very successful South American republic. It's a tremendous success story, but there was a lot of dark times. There was a lot of darkness on that road. And so that's, I guess, what I'm trying to get across with the title of the game. Play this game for any reason you want, and I'll be happy that you're playing the game. I want to see people playing the game. But I want to have people have their eyes open that if you're going to play a game representing insurgency and counterinsurgency, and that's something you're interested in, it's not a skip in the park.
Right.
You know, it's about terror and violence and death and drugs and crime and waste and expense and innocent people getting hurt. That is part of what happened. And my statement is we should play games about that if and because they help us understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's worthy of being understood.
Yeah. So at what point did you know that Andean Abyss was finished and ready to print?
I think Mark Herman's one who said, about game design, never finished, only published. So when we go to P500, we're typically still playtesting. And I had typically in the coin series did the non-player design work during the period of time that it was on P500. Pre-orders are coming in. And I typically wrote the background material, the playbook, the historical and play example stuff, only once it was actually an art. Andean Abyss had a shallow growth in pre-orders, right? As I said, it took many, many, many moons. And I was actually plotting it out. And we already had work underway on Cuba Libre, before Andean Abyss was printed. And A Distant Plane followed pretty shortly after that and got done very quickly. And those pre-orders went much quicker, and that kind of crossed the line on the graph, and I could compare those. So there was plenty of time to suss out, to feel warm and fuzzy about the readiness of the design, especially the non-solitaire part, before GMT would even consider it to put it into art based on the market response, right? So that was really not a difficulty. And you think it's finished when you stop changing stuff. I'm not trying to be snide with that, but if you're a designer like me, you just keep tinkering. You just can't always want to change stuff. You want to change stuff after it's been printed. It never seems, because
never seems finished.
And I'm not going to tell you what they are, but all of my published game, I'm very, very conscious of the big warts on those games, right? Because we didn't solve that problem before it was printed, and it's out there. And I'm always worried about that every time. And somebody said, "Oh, I played Andean Abyss." I'm like, "Okay, what happened?" I'm listening for this problem that I think is there. Did it come up? It didn't come up. Okay, I'm not going to mention it. Great, you like the game. So it's never really finished. But if I have the opportunity to change things because it hasn't been printed yet, and I'm just, I'm running out of the urge to change things,
then it feels like, cool. Cool.
Yeah, until 1,000 people play it and we find out what's really wrong with it. But that is till after it's printed. That's just the way it works.
Cool. Well, I have one more question, Volko. Do you have any advice for an aspiring game designer out there who maybe wants to make a designer coin game or a historical war game with asymmetric factions?
So do it, and start with what is the setting and the story that's really interesting, and then go to how do I represent it? In other words, I would not advise starting out with, I want to design a coin game, right? I would say play a bunch of games, play coin games, play a lot of other games, and then you have something that you're really interested in that happened historically, if it's a historical game, let's say. And you think there's enough interesting dynamics there, movement in the system, people doing stuff, reacting to each other, right? Change, dynamics. There's enough of that that it would be fun to act it out in a board game. Then do that. And then the next question is, okay, how do I represent? Who should the players be? Who are the key actors in that system? What are they trying to achieve? What should the victory conditions be? What ways did they use to achieve that? What should be game mechanics? What are players doing that represents that real world, whatever it is?
Right.
And then think about, okay, is there stuff like that in the coin series that fits? Is this like a 4-player situation, more or less? I mean, it's all simplification, right? Every model is a simplification. Every board game is a simplification, no matter how complicated. So can we effectively simplify all the people doing stuff in this situation that I'm interested in with 4 players? Will that work well? If it's an international system and there's 4 big countries and the rest are small countries, 4 players might be great, right? Maybe it's 3 players. Maybe it's 2 players. Maybe it's a solitaire game. Let the real world and your mental model of the real world guide what style of game, what mechanics you take from wherever and change and come up with new twists and apply to your purpose, right? Go from the purposes to simulate that reality on the game table to where do you go to find the way to do that, which may or may not be in the coin series.
Right. That was some deep knowledge you just dropped. Thank you so much, Volko, for being here today on Cardboard Creations and for sharing the backstory on how Andean Abyss was created. I know I'm very excited to just continue going through the coin series, and I have them all, I think, right now, except Liberty or Death, but I'm on the P500 now, so...
I'm not going to tell Harold that.
I mean, I am trying. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to delving into all of them. And I'm also really excited to finally play Nevsky and check out your Levian campaign series. I know, is it El Moravid is the new one coming out?
Yes.
Yes. And I already signed up for a session of Nevsky at the upcoming San Diego History Con.
Ah, fantastic. Great. I'll see you there.
Yeah, because that game looks beautiful. And it seems very different. So I'm very interested in trying that, and anything else with your name on it, I'm very interested in playing. Love Labyrinth. Haven't played Wilderness War yet, but very excited to. That's also on my shelf. But yeah, I mean, the coin series is just continuously evolving, and it's really special. I love seeing the new topics being covered. And it's like every time I look, there's a new one coming out, and it's very exciting to see how it's evolved over since 2012 when Andean Abyss first came out.
That's right, yeah, 2012. So yeah, thanks for the kind words, Candice, and thank you especially for letting me tell some tales here.
Oh, I love it. Thank you all for watching Cardboard Creations. Hopefully it's been as inspiring and fascinating for you as it has been for me. And remember, the only way to get something done is to start doing it.